Harry Potter story from another's perspective. Rowan Barrows and the Forgotten Prophecy. Chapter 2, Muggle Life. Rowan Barrows rubbed the sleep from his eyes and swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards creaking faintly under his weight. Morning light spilled in through the window, bright enough to catch on the dust motes drifting lazily through the air. Rowan's bedroom was the smallest in the house, but he didn't mind. It had a window that looked out over the garden, a wardrobe that stuck when you tried to open it too quickly, and a bed that squeaked if he rolled over too far in the night. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner where Candy, now 10 years older and twice as grumpy, had once launched himself after a spider and missed. The shelves above his desk were crowded with a jumble of things he refused to throw away. A broken watch, 2 empty ink bottles his grandmother swore had once belonged to his father, a row of library books, and a glass jar containing what he insisted was a dragon's tooth, but was, in fact, an unusually pointy rock. In the corner leaned his father's old guitar. One of the strings had snapped years ago, leaving it unplayable, and the wood was scratched where his father's wedding ring had once struck it over and over as he played. Rowan didn't touch it much, partly because it was broken, partly because it felt like touching someone else's memories. Rowan himself didn't look especially remarkable at first glance. Average height for his age, a little on the thin side with light brown hair streaked with flecks of blonde that caught the sunlight, curling not too much but just enough to be permanently untidy. His eyes were a clear blue, curious but steady, set in a face lightly freckled by hours spent outside helping his mum or kicking a football in the park. His mother always said he had a quiet face, but Eleanor insisted he had his father's grin when he chose to use it, a grin that appeared rarely but lit up his whole face when it did. Pinned to his wall was a faded poster of the Montrose Magpies, sent by his father last summer along with a note about keeping up his Quidditch skills. Rowan kept the letter tucked behind the frame where his mother wouldn't see it. Rowan's mother didn't like letters from his father much, or magic, or anything that hinted at the world beyond Mossfield Way. Rowan wasn't forbidden to know about it. It was impossible with his grandmother around and visiting his father on weekends. But he wasn't allowed to do anything. No spells, no tricks, no funny business of any kind in the house. Normal childhood, she always said briskly when his grandmother muttered about him needing to learn. He can have all that when he's older, his mother would say. And his grandmother didn't argue, though sometimes when she tried a simple charm, just to warm the teapot or light the fire, the magic seemed to flicker faintly in her hands before sputtering out. She always laughed it off, said she was just out of practice, but Rowan didn't miss the way her hands sometimes trembled after, or the way she'd rest longer in her chair afterward, Candy curled like a fat cream cushion on her lap. Rowan finally mustered the energy and pulled on his oldest jumper, elbows gone a bit thin, cuffs frayed from years of climbing fences and trees, and opened his door to the narrow upstairs hallway. Number 22 wasn't a big house, but it had a kind of crooked charm. The wallpaper along the landing was faded in places, patterned with little blue flowers that had long since given up being cheerful. A row of family photos hung slightly askew on the wall. One of his father and Uncle Corvin as boys, grinning like mad, another of his mother on her wedding day, bouquet clutched tight and hair far neater than it had been in years. One of Eleanor in her favourite armchair looking as though the photographer had interrupted something important. The floor sloped just enough to make a marble roll on its own, and the banister wobbled if you leaned on it too hard, though Eleanor swore it had been like that since long before Rowan was born. As Rowan headed downstairs, the familiar smell of tea drifted up from the kitchen. The living room lay just off the hall, its armchairs sagging slightly in the middle, a knitted blanket draped over the back of the sofa, and a low table stacked with gardening magazines his mother never quite had time to read. The fire in the hearth was cold and grey now, but the blackened marks along the stone where his father used to arrive and leave by flue powder were still there, faint but stubborn. His mother had scrubbed at them more than once. They never came out. Candy, older and considerably fatter than in his curtain-climbing days, blinked at Rowan from his favourite spot on the windowsill, before leaping down with the dignity only cats can muster. He landed heavily and stalked toward the kitchen without so much as a glance. Rowan followed the cat through the doorway, bare feet cold on the tile. The kitchen smelled of toast and strong tea. His mother was at the counter, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, attacking a loaf of bread with the kind of efficiency she brought to everything in life. Eleanor sat at the table in her usual chair, shawl tucked around her shoulders, knitting needles resting in her lap. Steam curled from the teapot in front of her, and Candy sprawled on the windowsill behind like a furry gargoyle. "Morning," Rowan said, sliding into the seat opposite Eleanor. "You're late," said his mother without looking up. "It's summer," Rowan pointed out. She gave him the sort of look that said the summer holidays were no excuse for laziness. Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling. "Let the boy wake up in his own time, Margaret. It's not as though the world will end if he has a lie-in." His mother said, which in her language could have meant anything from "you're right to the garden's on fire." Eleanor reached for the teapot and gave her wand a little flick. At least she tried to. The spout sputtered, shook once, and produced a thin trickle of tea before falling still. Eleanor sighed, set the wand down, and reached for the pot with her hands instead. "Magic never behaves for me in the mornings," she said lightly. His mother gave her a look over her shoulder. "Maybe it's a sign you should just pick it up like everyone else." "I'll have you know," Eleanor said, pouring tea into Rowan's mug. "I once charmed a whole banquet single-handedly." "Bet it was cold by the time you got it working," muttered his mother, slicing the bread like it had personally offended her. Rowan hid a smile behind his mug. "Eat," his mother said, putting the bread on the table with a thump. "We've got Mrs. Perkins's hedges this morning and the vegetable beds this afternoon, and the roses out front need doing before it rains." Rowan nodded, already chewing. He'd been helping his mum with gardening work for as long as he could remember. Some kids spent Saturdays at the park. Rowan spent his with a pair of gloves, a trowel, and his mother's to-do list. Eleanor stirred her tea slowly. "You work him too hard, Margaret. He's not a pack mule." His mother didn't answer, which usually meant she thought Eleanor was probably right, but didn't want to admit it. Before they left, his mother set down her knife and said, "Oh, before you go anywhere near the van, check the greenhouse. The tomatoes looked thirsty yesterday, and if the cucumbers droop again, I'll have your hide." Rowan nodded and headed out the back door, Candy padding after him like a furry shadow. The morning air was cool and smelled faintly of earth and mint. Dew clung to the grass, soaking the cuffs of his trousers as he made his way down the garden path. The little greenhouse sat tucked behind a tangle of lilac and honeysuckle, its glass panes clouded with age. Inside, the air was warm and damp, thick with the scent of soil and green things. Condensation ran down the glass like tiny rivers. Rowan crouched beside the tomato plants, their thin vines stretching toward the ceiling. He touched one leaf, feeling the faint stickiness of it, and smiled to himself. "You're doing all right," he murmured. Candy jumped up onto the bench beside him, tail flicking dangerously near the watering can. "Don't even think about it," Rowan said. The cat ignored him, batted at a hanging leaf, and sneezed when a drop of water hit his nose. Rowan chuckled softly and lifted the watering can, tipping just enough to darken the soil. As he worked, a beam of sunlight broke through the misted panes, scattering golden light across the rows of seedlings. For a heartbeat, it all looked almost enchanted. Dust motes spinning like sparks in the air. He'd seen his grandmother charm plants before, long ago when her magic had been stronger. He sometimes wondered if magic wasn't just spells at all. Maybe it was simply caring enough to make something grow. When he was done, he closed the door carefully behind him and looked back once more. The greenhouse gleamed faintly in the morning sun. Ordinary, quiet, but somehow watchful. "Come on, old man," he told Candy, who yawned and trotted after him. "Mum will think we've joined the tomatoes." The tomatoes looked perkier already, and Candy, who had spent the visit attempting to stalk a beetle the entire time, trotted beside him with the smug air of a creature who believed he'd accomplished something too. Just as Rowan reached the back door, his mother's voice floated out of the kitchen. "Rowan, shoes! And don't forget the trowel. I won't have you borrowing Mrs. Perkins' blunt excuses for tools." Rowan made a face and leaned down to tug on his boots. The left boot, as usual, refused to cooperate. The heel folded inwards stubbornly, catching his sock. The laces started flicking everywhere. He yanked harder. Nothing. He tried to wiggle his foot. Still nothing. "Oh, come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Please." And then the boot jerked sharply upright with a little hop on its own. Rowan froze, 1 foot half in the air mid-hop, as the boot slid perfectly into place around his heel with a faint pop. He stared at it. Candy stared at it. The boot sat innocently, as though it had always intended to behave. Rowan's heart thudded once, loud in his chest. He flexed his toes. The leather was warm, as if the boot had been sitting in sunlight, though he'd taken it straight from indoors. Magic. He glanced toward the kitchen window. Eleanor could have seen. His mum could have seen. But no one came rushing out. Candy, apparently satisfied, began washing his paw like nothing unusual had happened. Rowan forced himself to breathe normally and pulled on his second boot, which thankfully behaved like a normal shoe. As he stood, the back door creaked open, and his mother leaned out, hair tied back, brows raised. "What are you doing out here? The van's already running." "Nothing," Rowan blurted, far too quickly. "Just getting my boots on." His mother squinted at him. Rowan tried to look as non-magical as humanly possible, which mainly made him stand very stiff and smile too hard. "Right," she said slowly. "Well, hurry up. We can't keep Mrs. Perkins waiting. She'll start pruning herself and then it'll be a disaster." She disappeared back inside. Rowan let out a breath he hadn't realised he'd been holding. He looked down once more at his shoe. Warm. Still warm. His mother had already packed up the van, her gloves tucked into her belt and her hair escaping its scarf. "Greenhouse still standing?" she asked. "For now," Rowan said. "Tomatoes are fine." "Good. Then finish your breakfast and let's go before Mrs. Perkins decides she can prune her hedge herself." Eleanor raised her eyebrows. She'd never dare. It would ruin her favourite pastime, complaining. Rowan's mother smirked. "You're probably right." Rowan swallowed the last bite of toast, grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and kissed Eleanor on the cheek. "We'll be back before tea," he said. Eleanor patted his hand. "Take your time, my boy. I'll be here keeping the fire warm, and Candy fed, if he decides I'm worthy of the honour." Candy, sprawled in a patch of sunlight on the floor, flicked an ear in regal indifference. His mother tied her scarf over her hair, already checking the day's list in her head. "Just try not to set the house on fire while we're gone," she said dryly. Eleanor raised her eyebrows over the rim of her teacup. "One little fireplace blaze, and you never let me forget it." "It was the curtains, Eleanor," his mother said, opening the door. "Curtains." "They were ugly curtains," Eleanor called after them as they stepped out into the cool morning air. "Did the house a favour, really?" Rowan grinned to himself as he followed his mother down the path toward the waiting van. Behind them, Eleanor sipped her tea, and the old house seemed to settle back into its familiar quiet. The van, that no longer bore the name Barrows, rattled its way down Mossfield Way, the back full of trowels, gloves, watering cans, and the slightly lopsided wheelbarrow. Rowan's mother swore she'd replace every spring, but never did. Rowan sat in the passenger seat with the window open, the wind tangling his hair as the houses rolled past. They stopped first at Mrs. Perkins' place, because of course they did. Mrs. Perkins was already waiting at the gate, arms folded, eyes bright. "Morning, Mrs. Barrows." "Morning, Rowan," she called, her voice carrying halfway down the street. "You'll never guess what I heard about the baker's boy." "I haven't been Mrs. Barrows for years, Mrs. Perkins," Rowan's mother corrected smoothly, hefting the lawnmower from the back of the van. Mrs. Perkins blinked. "Oh, right, Mrs. Ashford." She leaned in conspiratorially toward Rowan before his mother could say more. "She doesn't want to hear it," she whispered, far too loudly. "But you should. The baker's boy has gone and got himself expelled again." "Mrs. Perkins," Mrs. Ashford cut in, "if you want this hedge done before Christmas, let the boy work." Mrs. Perkins looked affronted but shuffled aside as Rowan grabbed the shears. Rowan wasn't surprised by this news. The baker's son Matthew had been expelled from schools before. Matthew Baker had been the town bully for as long as Rowan could remember, and for reasons Rowan understood all too well, Matthew had always chosen him as his favourite target. Things had a habit of going wrong for Matthew whenever he cornered Rowan. A fence vanishing at the wrong moment, a sack of compost bursting open, his dog that suddenly refused to obey. Matthew's dog's name was Molly. Matthew had trained her himself and he'd like to show her off. She wasn't vicious, not really, but she knew tricks that made people laugh until they were the ones being laughed at. Stealing shoes, dragging them out into the street, dropping them just out of reach while Matthew watched with a grin. Molly always listened to Matthew, except when Rowan was there. Rowan shifted the shears in his hands and started on Mrs. Perkins's hedge. While Mrs. Ashford started on the front garden, Rowan trimmed the hedge under Mrs. Perkins's watchful gaze. She supplied running commentary on the neighbours as though Rowan had asked for it. Who'd painted their front door a dreadful colour? Who'd bought a new car far too fancy for their income? Who was definitely hiding something, because she'd seen them sneaking out at 3 a.m. Rowan made polite noises in the right places until his mother announced they were finished, and hustled him back into the van before Mrs. Perkins could start on a second round. Next came Mrs. Dawlish, who stood in the middle of her garden with the air of a woman awaiting disaster. "Mind the peonies," she said sharply, as Mrs. Ashford unloaded the tools, "and the lavender, and the lilies. Oh, and don't touch the gnomes. My sister gave me those." Rowan had been here before. He knew the peonies from the lavender, knew the lilies needed watering but not too much, and knew the gnomes, with chipped hats, would bite if you tried to move them. Rowan eyed the cracked, leering gnomes in the flower bed and wondered if there was a polite way to suggest his mother accidentally hit them with the wheelbarrow. He didn't need Mrs. Dawlish circling like a hawk, but she did anyway, offering instructions Rowan didn't require and advice he didn't need. He ignored her fussing with the calm, practiced ease of someone used to this sort of thing. The flower beds ended up neat, the roses pruned just right, the paths swept clean. Rowan didn't work fast, but he worked well, the kind of work his mother never had to check twice. By the time they escaped, Mrs. Dawlish, inspecting every leaf for imagined damage, Rowan felt he'd survived some kind of interrogation. Mrs. Ashford checked her watch as they packed the tools. "Need to swing by Mr. Hollis's for bread," she said. "Pop in and grab them, will you? And don't let him talk your ear off." Rowan liked the corner shop. The bell above the door gave a friendly jangle, and the air always smelled of coffee and old newspapers. The narrow aisles were stacked with everything from tinned beans to crossword books and odd souvenirs that had no business being there at all. Mr. Hollis stood behind the counter, polishing the same jar of boiled sweets he'd been polishing for the past 10 years. His bald head gleamed beneath the strip light. "Well, if it isn't young Barrows," he said cheerfully, catching himself mid-sentence. "Grown another inch since last week, have you?" "Maybe half," Rowan said, placing the basket on the counter. Mr. Hollis began ringing things up with his usual deliberate care. "Your mum keeping busy? Gardens will be blooming soon. Funny year, though, everything coming in late." Rowan smiled politely. "Tell your mother I've put the bill on her account," Mr. Hollis said, handing over the paper bag. "And you tell that gran of yours the tea she likes is coming in next Thursday. Imported, special order." "I will. Thanks, Mr. Hollis." "Good lad. Oh, and give Candy a pat from me, if he'll let you." Rowan laughed, pushing open the door as the bell jangled again. The afternoon air smelled of rain on brick. Their final stop was Mr. Griffith's, who met them at the gate wearing his usual expression of doom. Mrs. Ashford handed Rowan the trowel. "You weed the front beds. I'll mow before he predicts the end of the world again." But Mr. Griffiths was already listing omens. Crows, clouds, unusually aggressive squirrels, and once, this seemed to disturb him most, a hedgehog staring at him for far too long. Rowan nodded solemnly, the way you do when someone might be completely mad but also might be right. By the time they packed the tools back into the van, Mrs. Ashford's scarf had slipped loose, Rowan's hands were covered in dirt, and Mr. Griffiths was explaining that he'd read somewhere about cats sensing evil. Candy, Rowan thought, would probably just sleep through it. The sun was sinking by the time they rattled back up the drive to number 22, the van coughing tiredly as Mrs. Ashford switched off the engine. The front room lamp was already glowing behind the curtains. Eleanor was waiting in her chair, Candy perched on the arm like a sentry. Both of them looked up as Rowan came in first, arms full of gardening gloves and half-empty watering cans. "Back in one piece, I see," Eleanor said, voice warm but faint. "Mostly," Rowan said, dropping the gloves into the basket by the door. "Mrs. Dawlish nearly bit me." "She bites everyone," Eleanor said, eyes crinkling. Candy stretched lazily, yawned and leapt down to wind himself around Rowan's legs, purring like he hadn't spent the entire week ignoring him. Rowan crouched to scratch behind his ears before the cat sauntered off toward the kitchen. Mrs. Ashford was already hanging up her scarf. "Dinner in an hour. Wash your hands before you touch anything." "Yes, Mum," Rowan said automatically. The house settled into its evening rhythm. Eleanor clicking her knitting needles together, Mrs. Ashford moving briskly about in the kitchen. The smell of food drifted in, warm and familiar. Outside, the garden darkened. Inside, number 22 held its warmth, its quiet, its ordinary life.